All right, we are now live recording, and I want to introduce Suzanne Fuller, who is the author who's going to be talking to you today about her first book for children. So I want to tell you a few things. First of all, my name is Jennifer Widman. I'm with the South Dakota Humanities Council, and I just want to welcome you all to the South Dakota Festival of Books and Young Readers Festival. We're just so pleased that you're joining us here. We are always happy to spend time celebrating books with readers of every age. So thank you for joining us. I do want to mention just very quickly that the festival would not be possible without the very generous support of many organizations and individuals who donate to us and sponsor us. We have a little festival guide publication that some of you may have seen, and all of the donors are listed on the back. You can also find them on our webpage, which is sdbookfestival.com. And we have a few of those that are special donors who gave money so that we could provide books to some third graders around the state by Allison McGee. And those are First Bank and Trust, Black Hills Reads, and Northern Hills Federal Credit Union. The Young Readers Festival includes about a dozen authors and illustrators of children's books and young adult books. If you want to buy books by any of these authors, we are going to have buttons on our website, sdbookfestival.com, that will take you straight to some bookstores that are selling those books online. And of course, you can also find information on under every author's entry on our festival website to find out who their publishers are and where you can get those. So keep an eye out for that. And today's program features, as I said, Suzanne Fuller, and she is going to be talking about her book, The Girl Who Moved to the Town That Wasn't There. So you might be curious as to how you could move to a town that wasn't there. Well, she will let you know. So let me just tell you a few things about Suzanne. She is an award-winning journalist. She has worked as a staff writer, a women's page editor, and an investigative reporter for the Minneapolis Star newspaper. She taught journalism at Kentucky Wesleyan College, the University of Sioux Falls, and the University of South Dakota. She now volunteers for nonprofit organizations serving children, families, and the arts in South Dakota and Hawaii. And she has just published, as I said, her first children's book. She and her husband, Larry, live in Sioux Falls. And today she is with you wherever you are watching from in the state. And Suzanne, I would like to just let you take it away and tell us about the girl who moved to the town that wasn't there.
Thank you, Jennifer. I am delighted to be here. This is one of my favorite events. And I am so pleased that this Young Readers program is getting the attention it is. The Young Readers are the ones I wrote this book for. I was doing research on the family genealogy at the Moody County Museum, and I came across the bound copies of the Egan Express from 1880 to 1881. I was doing family genealogy, and I soon found myself not even thinking about the family. I was so interested in this town and how it was building and how it was growing. And my first thought, and this is an honest statement, my first thought was, I need to write a book for South Dakota children so they know how the state was set up, how the towns were built, and the people who came there. So this is a wonderful opportunity for me to tell you about this book that I indeed did write. It was a long journey, and sometimes, as it always is when you're writing. The early people, this was 140 years ago. And for those of you who are children, that is a long time ago. It's probably hard to even comprehend that. But the towns were built as the country moved westward. The railroads would come out and they would lay out tracks, and they would identify where they were going to have places where they could pick up passengers, where they could pick up goods, where they could deliver supplies. And those became the nucleus for the towns. And Egan, Dakota Territory was one of those towns that had been designated as a railroad station. The responsibility for making those towns who they were really was up to the early settlers who moved there. The book title says The Town That Wasn't There, and that's really true. There was no town. In June of 1880, when my book starts, there is one building on that prairie, which is going to be Egan, and that is the office and home of the newspaper editor. That's it. There's nothing else out there in terms of buildings, except for the newspaper editor's home. And that's how it started. Now, of course, you've got other people that are now going to start moving in because it's being advertised, it's being promoted. And there are not houses there. It's not like you could go into Sioux Falls, like if you were going to move to Sioux Falls and find all these homes for sale. There was nothing there. So what they did is they went to Roscoe, which was 2 miles north of Sioux Falls. Sioux Falls is being identified as a town that the railroads were going by. Roscoe had that good luck 2 years earlier. And then the railroads changed their mind. And they took out the track and the stop at Roscoe, moved it 2 miles south to Egan. And there was no reason to stay in Roscoe. You couldn't bring in supplies, you couldn't bring in people to shop, you couldn't bring in employees. So it just folded. Within 90 days, that whole town was emptied out. They had put all of their buildings, their houses, their stores, their offices, even a hotel that they cut in half so they could move it to Egan, on horse-drawn wagons and taken them 2 miles over the trails of the prairie to Egan so that they would have homes. It was quite a remarkable feat. I'm still impressed that they did that. My grandfather, my great-grandfather actually, was hired as the grain buyer for the elevator in Roscoe. And I wasn't setting out to do this a biography of my family, but what it offered me was the opportunity to create a family. I had a mother, a father, a big sister, and a 10-year-old. And I was going to build my family in this book around the family and my family. So I started out doing that, and it worked. I think it worked quite well. It was a fictitious family, except there are many things in there that are actually true. This whole story is really history in the making. W.S. Coban was the first editor of the paper, and he was followed 6 months later by George Lanning, who was the second editor. And they were enthusiastic supporters of this little town. This little town could do no wrong. They promoted it. They were cheerleaders for it. The editor in the book comes across as a major cheerleader. And that wasn't because I created it that way. It was because that's who he really was. He was a cheerleader for the town. He would exhort people. I had never heard the word dooryards before. He would exhort people to clean up their dooryards, or else people will think we're not an efficient, prosperous community. Well, it's the area outside your front door, your backyard. What did I know? But that's what they were. So he was on the ball. He wasn't going to let anything go by. I wanted to, as they were moving down there, I wanted to make sure that I am very detail oriented, very visually oriented. So I wanted to set up a map of the downtown area of this new town, Egan. So I drew a map. The main street's called 3rd Street. I drew that. It went from the grain elevators down towards the river, and it had the cross streets and the whole thing. And so after the first couple editions of the paper, I put in the stables, the saloon, the hotel, the grocer, the dry goods, all the little businesses and stores that had set up along there. This is great. This is going to be so cool. I'll use it in my book. Except the next week I went back and things had changed. We're now new people in those buildings. Old people had moved on. They had moved across the street. After about 3 weeks of that kind of activity, I gave up. And there's no business district map in my book of Egan. Though I had better luck charting the storms. The first blizzard came October 15th. And it was horrible. It was absolutely horrible. People were caught out in it. Trains were stalled. It was a terrible blizzard. And by December, this was a pattern that kept going. They had just a horrible winter. The editor called it what it was, the winter of perpetual elemental fury. And it was. You had a hard time telling when one storm started and the other storm ended. So I started charting them. I have charts in my book now, that little red dots all through those months of when a storm came through, so I could get a feeling for what was really happening there. When I finished that draft, I went back to those 4th and 5th graders in Overland Park, Kansas that I had used and asked them to give me some feedback and what I could do. And they had plenty of ideas on what I should be doing. And they were just terribly helpful. And then they gave me a whole stack of questions they wanted answered. So I thought, if I'm talking to 4th graders and 5th graders, I might know more what they want to know if I use the 4th graders and 5th graders question from Overland Park, Kansas. So that's what I'm going to do today. I'm going to tell you their questions, not all of them because I had a stack of them, but I picked out some and I will ask those questions and then I will answer them and hopefully will be of interest to you. Why did I want to write about 1880? Well, that was because that's when the town started and I wanted the book to start when the town started. That was where my information started. I didn't have to do any more filtering or sifting of stuff. That was it. And I also wanted to give credit to, I wanted people to see over the time, the kind of work that Mr. Coban and Mr. Lanning had done. I don't know if you know how newspapers used to put together, but they had metal frames that were maybe that long and that tall. I'm not doing a very good job of that, but they stood in front of a big wooden case that had all the letters of the alphabet in it in metal type. And so they would go and they would go the word the, okay, T, H, E, T, O, W, and they would put them in these metal cases. They had to build every word, every sentence, every paragraph, every story, letter by letter. And you've got to think of the mind-boggling work that was, but they did it and they did a good job and they were very, very enthusiastic supporters of the town. They wanted to know how I did my research. It was easy because I first of all started out with the newspapers. I had, like I said, the bound copies from 1880, 1881, and I had them all in my home because I now owned them. I had bought them, it was a roundabout way, but I now owned them. So we could take pictures of the newspaper articles. I had proof that everything I wrote was actually in a paper. I could tell you where it was. I could tell you the date. I could tell you the page. But then I realized I really was shortchanging the reader if I didn't go further than just the newspapers. So when my husband and I traveled, I found any place I could find that looked like they had 1880 kind of history stuff. Went over to the Pioneer Village in Worthington, Minnesota. Rode on steam engine trains in Colorado so I could talk to the conductor about how they kept warm in the wintertime and what they used. That's where I found out about the buffalo robes in the book. Then my great-grandfather had been captured at Bryce's Crossroads by the Confederates when he was in the war, and then had been taken to Andersonville Prison, which was a horrible prison in Georgia. And so we went to Bryce's Crossroads, we went to Andersonville so I could be where he had been. And then I was at a wedding in Virginia, and antique shops are sometimes hard for me to pass up. So I'm in this antique shop and I'm looking at old books, and here is a grammar school arithmetic book. So, okay, well, that sounds like it could be of the time. I opened it up. It was from the early 1880s, and I'm just paging through it, and whammo, out jumps a question for a problem, a math problem about Dakota Territory and the state of Massachusetts. If the Dakota Territory has got so many square miles and Massachusetts has how many square miles, how many states of Massachusetts could you put into Dakota Territory? I thought I had hit the jackpot. All the research that I'd done, I really, really love that. That was just great. And it's in the book, as you might assume. I also examined photographs of that time. They didn't have to be personal photographs. I looked them from collectors. I looked at them in museums. What did they show me? And I'm not looking at the overall picture. What I'm trying to look at is details. What do the roads look like? Are there ruts? Are they muddy? Are there animals jumping around the feet of the transportation animals? What about on the walls? Are there photographs on the wall? That's okay if there's a photograph, but what's in the photograph? Does it show something detailed about that room, about those people? So I really, really went over photographs. One of my favorite discoveries was I'm going through old family pictures, and I have this wonderful picture of, this is Virgie here and her older sister, who's 4 years older. And I'm thinking, oh, that's a nice picture. And a couple of pages later, I come across this book page of just Virgie. She's now got bangs. And so I can now put in a bang incident, part of the story and have it be true. That was the kind of thing I was looking for. Also in the paper, I tried to find what the connections were among the people in Egan. They had connections, they were doing things together. But what did that tell me about who they were and what kind of problems they faced? Well, I got hooked on Charlie Harden. He was a man who lived in Roscoe. He had a wife and I assume some children, but we never heard very much about them. But Charlie had moved to Roscoe when it opened 2 years ago. And now he was moving, like so many people were, to Egan. It was a major event in his life, I would think. He had to move his house, he had to move his business, and he got them all settled down in Egan. And then the newspaper said he's building an addition to his house. I thought, way to go, Charlie. You must be having a prosperous career here. Well, except 3 weeks later, there was a story in the paper about Mrs. Charlie Harden, who had returned to their hometown in Minnesota. I thought, not a good sign. And a week later, Charlie had sold the business and he was on the train heading back to their hometown. Those kinds of things, people who came out on the prairie, but they had such challenges. If they were a claim out in the middle of the fields, they had isolation challenges. If they were even in town, they could have challenges because they didn't have friends or family there. They could have troubles with their jobs. Maybe it wasn't going really well. And the winter would have scared me off if I had been there that winter. It was so horrible. So people were moving in and out. They were moving for a lot of different reasons. I did not use Charlie's particular story in my book, but I used another example of a family who the wife and the 2 boys went back early, and then the husband and the daughter followed. And that was a takeoff, a fictitious takeoff of the fact of Charlie Harden. I also made it a rule that if I was reading something, I went, well, I didn't know that. I would go find out, what I didn't know. And one of the things, this is so minor, but you realize that this is not a major historical book. It's a book for children. And so I'm looking at it and I'm going, okay, they're talking about oysters. There's a new shipment of oysters that's arrived in this. And I thought, well, okay, that's nice. It seemed a little fancy for being out in the prairie in Dakota Territory in the 1880s. But I thought, well, if they're going to bring oysters out, that's okay. And then I saw numerous stories about oysters appearing on the different train shipments. And I thought, okay, I got to figure this out. So I went to my Pioneer cookbooks, which I also have a collection of, and went through and found lots of oyster recipes. There were recipes for oyster pot pie, fried oysters, scalped oysters, broiled oysters, oyster stew, curried oysters, oyster salad, pigs in a blanket, oyster sauce, oyster stuffing, mock oysters, fricasseed oysters, oyster fritters, oyster patties, pan oysters, oyster roast, and a Boston recipe for serving fried oysters with fresh tomato sauce and parsley. The write-up of a new restaurant that was opening, the only restaurant that was going to open in Egan at that point, promised a good square meal and a dish of fresh oysters. I never knew. Even better for those early pioneers, they could be frozen in the snowbanks. That winter, you realize they didn't have electric refrigerators in their kitchens that they could put their food into. They used the snowbanks to freeze their food. And it worked really well. Well, oysters could be frozen. So that was a really, really plus for them. And I also discovered later as I was reading something else that oysters were a very trendy food back in the 1880s and 1890s. Never knew that. How did I come up with the title? I'm now back to questions that the kids asked. How did I come up with the title? Well, we were living in Hawaii at the time, and the Maui Writers Conference was a huge, huge conference over there. So I signed up and I paid for a consultation with an agent, and I'm talking to this agent about this great book that I'm writing. And the agent next to us in a neighboring table turns around and she says, "I've got your title for you." I said, "Okay." I didn't even think at that point I needed a title. She said, "The Girl Who Moved to the Town That Wasn't There." And I went, "My gosh, can I use that?" And she said, "Yes." So that's the name of my book. It never wavered after that. The kids in Kansas wanted to know how many changes I made in the book. Well, I couldn't have kept enough sheets of paper to count that up, because when you're a writer, you're always making changes. You go back and you read the original, you go, "Oh shoot, that was a bad word. I can use a better word here." Or I need to flip these paragraphs around so they make more sense, so that they flow better. And I made lots of changes. And I hired people to be proofreaders for me, so I would catch as many mistakes as possible. I had several people who acted as early editors for me. My two really good editors that I had, that I absolutely have incredible, well, they were all good, but these two were at the end, so they were carrying the heavy load. One was Eric Brown, who's with the book production company in Golden Valley, Minnesota. And he was super. I was a little nervous because when I got my first email from him, after he had gotten my first draft, he said, "I want you to cut about 2,200 words from this." And I went, "Oh my gosh, I can't do that. That's impossible." But I thought, okay, well, he's getting paid to do this, so I will see what I can do. I cut 800 and I sent it back to him and I said, "Okay, what else now do you want me to cut?" And he said, "Nope, this is great. It improved the book. It's what I wanted. And you don't have to cut anything else." In fact, then he started adding stuff for me to add. So it wasn't the number that he was looking about. It was the quality of the writing he was working in. My second really good person to help me was Linda Hazelstrom, who's a very well-known author and poet in South Dakota. She lives near Hermosa. And she has a writing workshop. And I went out to 2 or 3 of them. And at the very first one, I learned a very valuable lesson. And that is the value of silence in the creative process. She has, every participant out there has their own bedroom. And in the bedroom she only has 3 or 4 people at a time. In the bedroom, there are, she has a window that looks out on her ranch land. It's beautiful. And a desk for your computer, a chair, and then a big easy chair as well as the bed. And you sit there, and there's no TV in the building. There's no radio. There are no loud conversations. There's no conversation pit outside your window. It is purely quiet, except for the insects, the birds, the grasses rustling, the wind blowing. It is marvelous. And so you sit there and you think, and you're having this problem. My problem was my 10-year-old main character. I had kept my grandmother's name, who was actually a 10-year-old girl who moved there at that time. She was actually there. And her name was Virgie. And I was not going to change my grandmother's name. But I knew that I'd already seen that there were some problems with some kids with the name of Virgie. So I thought, okay, I've got to deal with that. And so I sat there for maybe an hour, just thinking, watching the grasses wave, and the subconscious came up with the answer. And I found that happened several times. Linda really recommends that you have a quiet writing space in your home. And I have done that since I've come back. And it really does help. The value of silence in the creative process cannot be overestimated. It was absolutely a mind opener for me. Have I ever been out of thoughts? No, I had so much material to work with. My main problem was keeping it down to a reasonable amount that the kids would want to read. I like to put myself in the place of where I'm writing. And so I can generate ideas out of that situation. It's almost, I kind of feel like I'm in a play or a movie when I'm doing that. And I'm visually there. I can hear the sounds. I can figure out what's going on. And that's kind of like a movie. And they asked if I brainstormed it. And I went, no, I don't brainstorm except internal brain. That's the only way. Did I like to read when I was a child? Absolutely. The biggest disappointments of my day were when my folks told me I had to put down the book to come eat dinner or lunch. My dad always brought books home when he traveled. Is writing fun? Absolutely. I absolutely love it. It's like a puzzle. And you start putting it together and you get this book going and you get the story going. And all of a sudden you realize, oops, I got to take care of this at the end of the story before I get there, or I got to start this and then wrap it up. So it's all nothing sits alone in a book. It all is interacted and interwoven. And that was a fun challenge. I also used heirlooms to help me write and to get creativity going. And that was just plain fun. For example, I had old sleigh bells. And so I would sit there when I was writing about the snow and what they were doing. I'd sit there and jingle these sleigh bells. And it's amazing. Your creative mind can pick up on sounds like that. I also had a lovely little silver bell that has a horn handle. I don't know if you can tell that on the, probably not, but that's a horn handle. And this becomes an important part of the story with Virgie and her very best friend. The beautiful cover of a book. Now that's not a major thing, but it really can make a difference in your book. Virgie receives this book. It's a book of Longfellow poems, and she receives it for her birthday. No, maybe it's Christmas. Oh shoot, I'm sorry, I can't remember, but she gets it as a present. And when she opens it up, I have her put her hands over it and caress the violets, and hoping to get across to the kids that this book was really important and it's something to take care of and it's got value, and how much she loved to read. So I did that. I also had, this is an autograph book. Back in the 1880s, it was a big fad on the East Coast. And so of course the people in Dakota Territory picked up on the fad on the East Coast and bought autograph books also. But this book, when I went through it, I found a quote from Virgie's real sister, Louis, that says, "Destiny is not without thee, but within. Thyself must make thyself." So I used that in my book. And it's such a special thing. And I hope that what I'm trying to do is add authenticity to this book, that it's not all just made up, it's not all fiction, but there are real things with real people in the book. And this is one of them. This goes back to well, you don't need to see that. But anyway, it's the South Dakota. God, this book is really falling apart. It's the Massachusetts Dakota Territory math problem is in this book. I also used, my mind can go different ways when I'm trying to create a story or do something. And when I was Virgie does not want to move from Sioux Falls to Eagan. She's put up a strong argument to her folks for folks say, nope, we're moving. We'll give it 1 year. If after 1 year, Eagan is not our town and we're not happy, we will move on. Well, Virgie thinks, okay, I've got to have a way of keeping track of that. She doesn't have a cell phone. She doesn't have a nice big calendar she can use. So she's going to create her own calendar with a piece of paper and little hash marks on it so that each one equals a week. She wants it to be a secret. She doesn't want anybody else to know about it. Well, where can she keep it? She has a very small bedroom. It's got a single bed, a barrel with wool clothes in it, and a shelf. So I'm sitting there thinking, okay, where can I have Virgie hide her calendar? Well, you're going to really wonder about where my mind goes sometimes. But when I was a teenager, before I was a teenager, when I was a young teenager, I was babysitting. Oops. And I had babysitting money I wanted to keep so nobody would know about it. It was my secret stash. And I had a bedroom where I had the plant base was empty. I could stick my babysitting money up here. So I thought, okay, what would Virgie do? Well, she doesn't have a lamp, obviously, because they didn't have electricity, but she did have an old child's teapot that her grandparents in Austin, Minnesota had given her before they moved. So she put her paper in there, made her mark, put it back in there, and that's where she kept it. And she did that, excuse me, 12 times during the year. No, 52 times during the year. She put in 52 different marks. But it's amazing how your mind and your imagination can work together to come up with a solution to things. What were my favorite subjects in school? English and history. In 7th grade, I wanted to be a journalist. That wasn't quite where my teacher thought I should be, but I wanted to be a journalist. So I still wanted to be, but I gave it a break. And then when I was in 9th grade and I was now in high school, I was able to work for the high school newspaper. And I worked for that for 3 years. I was the editor my senior year. Then I went off to college and worked for that college paper, majored in journalism, and was an editor there. And then I went and became a staff writer for the Minneapolis Star, where I also served in a couple of different editing positions. So you can see why I'm going to bound newspaper copies for my inspiration for everything. That's who I am. That's where I come from. They asked what the hardest part was about being an author. And one of them was, I like to put myself in the scene. I like to see what I'm seeing. And we lived in Hawaii. So I'm sitting in my den and I'm looking out the window and I see sandy beaches, blue ocean, green palm fronds. And I'm trying to write about tiny particles of ice hitting the window of the schoolroom and the wind that is whipping the snow across the prairies. That was a stretch, but I made it work because what I did is I found that if I shut the doors to the den almost completely, I could channel that little trade wind a bit and it would feel cooler. So I just then put it down several degrees and felt that was what I was doing. The second thing that was hard was putting fiction in there. I had never done fiction. I'd been a newspaper writer. You don't write fiction when you're a newspaper writer. And so I had to figure out how I could do fiction. And I finally decided that in my mind, I could be pure to myself if I used fact to create the incident, but I could use fiction to make it interesting for the child to read. And that's what I did throughout the whole entire book. I had, at the end of the school year, they had a end of the year program. And all the parents came up and stood and lined up alongside of the thing at the schoolhouse. Well, I'd never been to a school program in 1880. I had no idea what they did, but so I went and thought, okay, maybe they had a spelling contest. So I had Virgie be in a spelling contest. She lost in the first round because she spelled cemetery A-R-Y instead of E-R-Y. And then her best friend, Lottie, read a selection from the village blacksmith because they passed that on the way to school every day. And Lottie loved Longfellow. So that worked out okay. But that was, again, where you had to go to your imagination to come up with that. And one of the things I did, I made sure that if I mentioned any book, any poem, any song, any piece of poetry, that it had been printed by 1880. I didn't want to have anything that came later than that I was having Virgie or Lottie do in 1880. That wouldn't have been fine. The big question was, how did I find my publisher? And I would guess anybody who's an author is going to sit there and go, okay, how did you find your publisher? It was just pure luck. Well, maybe not. I had been sending out copies, drafts of my book to various places, manuscripts, and I'd get letters back saying, oh, this is really interesting, but we aren't publishing this kind of a book this year. And I got 3 or 4 of those. And finally I was going, it would sometimes take 5 or 6 months to get those responses. And I was thinking, every year I have another birthday. I'm getting older. And when I hit my 76th birthday, I was really thinking I needed to put this book into overdrive. So I talked to Bill Hoskins. I had been a volunteer for the OLLI program, the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute in Sioux Falls. And as the volunteer there, I had introduced many people to put on their presentations, including Bill with all of his historical presentations down at the courthouse. So finally, one day after I had heard his program and I got up all my nerve and I said, Bill, I said, I have written a book. Would you be willing to read it and tell me if you can think of a couple of publishers in the area who would be willing to publish it? Because I'm thinking I can maybe get somebody specific who would really plug into this topic. He said, yeah, he'd read it. So I left it with him, came back 2 or 3 weeks later, and he said, the museum wants to publish your book. I thought I'd hit a home run. I mean, here it was, a Dakota Territory story. I now had a well-respected South Dakota historian who was going to lead the publishing effort, and I was a South Dakota author. I thought, what more could I want? I was thrilled. At the beginning of this presentation, I talked, am I still okay?
Yep, maybe about 5 minutes.
And do that. Okay, that's just what I was looking at. I talked about the critical role the early pioneers played in the creation of these towns. And they were a remarkable bunch. They came together and they did what they needed to do. The saloon owner downtown put up a huge, they called it a very large street lamp. Well, it went all the way down to the depot. Now that doesn't sound like a big deal, but when you think that, when you know that the trains come in at 12 or 12:30 in the middle of the night, and there are no street lights, the street lamp was a huge benefit for those travelers that they now had downtown. The businessmen in town built a bridge over the Sioux River so that the farmers could take their grains to the Egan elevator rather than the Flander elevator. There was a tornado, and the next morning, the people were all downtown hammering and sawing and putting back the houses, putting them back on their foundations, doing anything they could. The stagecoach, this full stagecoach came down the riverbank one day too fast, and everybody went scrambling and down the bank, and they came out and they calmed the horses and took care of the passengers and did what they could. Sidewalks were built by the local merchants. They put up wooden sidewalks in front of their stores. During that horrible winter, calls would go out to come shovel off the tracks. And you've got to think how depressing that must have been to go out in the morning, shovel like mad, only to have the tracks snowed back in by night. In the spring, when there were floods, they lost the bridge over to the east side of the town, and they set up a ferry service. A guy set up a ferry service, but he told people that if they were coming across the river to go to church on Sunday morning, he would not charge them to do that. They could do that for free. Quickly, I want to tell you about, they really wanted to recreate what was happening elsewhere. There were strawberry ice cream socials on the East Coast. So now they were having them in Egan. The only problem was the first one was so popular that they had more people than they did strawberries, but it was a huge success. And the other thing that they did was they had a 4th of July celebration. And I loved it because they called it our national day, a good old fashioned, celebrate in a good old fashioned way. And this is 140 years ago, remember. This is 1881 by now. The newspaper is promoting it. They're going to have a potato sack race, a foot race, pony race, horse race with cash prizes, a grease pig catching contest, The Winner Kept the Pig, the Grease Pole Climbing Competition, and more. I have to tell you, in 1966, my husband and I went to Bryceland, Minnesota, down south here of I-29, no, I-90, and we went to a good old-fashioned 4th of July celebration that had many of these same activities. Not the grease pig, that was outlawed by them. But I thought, wow, our interpretation of old-fashioned, I did not stay constant back then. They were, oh, I've got to tell you the one thing that brought me back to 2020. The newspaper one day, I'm looking through it, and there's an ad for a catalog from Connecticut for holiday gifts. And the next week, there is a story by the editor saying, shop local. He didn't use those words, but that's what he was saying. He was saying shop local. There were horrible diseases back then, smallpox. Vermilion essentially quarantined itself against smallpox. If you hadn't had a vaccination, you couldn't come in. And if you came in, you'd be fined $25. Sioux Falls schools kicked out anybody who hadn't had a vaccination shot. So it was a tough time, but the people had fun. They held concerts and dances in the schoolhouse. They had, my favorite was the literary society that they had. And they met weekly. It was open to anybody who wanted to come. They put the notice in the paper. They had debates, book reports, entertainment, good food, good conversation, neighborhood news. And it was just a wonderful way for people to develop a friendship and a camaraderie. And the best part that I read, well, the best part, it wouldn't have gotten me there, but I read 2 stories where they were still partying at 3 a.m. in the morning. That's a time I don't even recognize. Well, I thank you for being part of my Festival of Books presentation. It's exciting to be part of it. I'm a big fan of the event, and I hope to see you sometime in person somewhere. Thank you.
Thank you, Suzanne, for being with us and for telling us a little bit about your book. And again, if anybody is interested, it is called The Girl Who Moved to the Town That Wasn't There. And I believe you can buy it at the Old Courthouse Museum store. Is it out right now for?
Yep, it's there.
So if you're in the Sioux Falls area, or I bet you could go to their website and find out some more things about it too. So thank you so much, Suzanne. And I hope that everybody who's watching will check around on our website and find some of our other presentations by authors for children and readers of every age.